Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time this morning and look forward to talking to you or with you about reserve studies. This course is approved for 1 hour of continuing education towards your CMCA designation. So at the end of the presentation, my email will be on there. So if you are attending this live, please just send me over an email and we'll make sure you get that certificate and signed up for the continuing education credit. So the agenda today, what are we going to cover? First, we're going to start talking about reserves. What are reserves? What is a reserve study? How should you facilitate the reserve study as a manager? And then once you receive it, how do you interpret it? So first and foremost, what are reserves? Well, reserves are funds that are specifically allocated for capital repair or replacement of the common elements that are maintained by the association. So it is focused on common elements and those big ticket items. So you probably have an operating account for those routine expenditures, management fees, insurance, landscaping, maybe pool maintenance, kind of those regularly reoccurring expenses. Then there should be a separate account for these long-term kind of big ticket items that really aren't funded out of that general maintenance or operating, more of a reserve expense. And so there's just typically a separate account, a reserve fund, and it's essentially a savings account for those special element or those long-term elements, the capital repair and replacement. So the first step is determining what is association maintained. The governing docs are the best place to really start, but unfortunately we know there isn't always sufficient clarity in those documents. While a reserve specialist is great at forecasting useful life and replacement costs, they really aren't the correct profession to determine ownership. So if there is any ambiguity or uncertainty with the documents, we do recommend consulting an attorney to have them review your documents and give you a legal interpretation on those maintenance responsibilities and ownership. Really kind of drilling down with what the association truly is responsible for versus possibly homeowners or maybe even another entity. It is important to take into account any historical practice as well. Maybe the homeowners are responsible for replacement of their windows, but the trim is painted by the association. If there are historical practices and it's the way the association operates and functions, it is important to relay that information to the reserve specialist so they can set the reserve study up accordingly. And so that will make it a qualified reserve component. Now, when we say common, what exactly do we mean there? There's common and there's limited common. Really, a common element means all portion of a condominium other than the units, and it includes both general and limited common elements. So anything that the association is responsible, basically anything on the property other than the actual units themselves. Limited common now is a type of common element, but it means that a portion of those elements are allocated by the declaration for the exclusive use of one or more, but less than all units. So an example here I like to use is a balcony. It might be a common element to where the association does maintain it and is responsible for a replacement of that, but the actual use is limited to typically the owner that has direct access to that balcony. So that would be kind of considered a limited common. It's a common element in nature, but the use is limited to one or more, but less than all units. So what is a reserve study? CAI defines the reserve study by two kind of main components. There's both a physical evaluation and a financial analysis of the community. So the first step in conducting a reserve study is determining the reserve components. To do that, CAI has created a 4-part test. So first and foremost, it has to be association responsibility. The element has to be the responsibility of the association to maintain. So using an example of a condominium, the interior of the units would be excluded. That's not the association's responsibility. It's not something that should be considered for the reserve study. Maybe it's a large HOA and their streets are maintained by the Department of Transportation, then those should also be excluded because they're not the association's responsibility. So now to drill down a little bit further, now that we know we're looking at those common elements that are the association's responsibility, the element has to have a limited useful life. What we mean by limited is that typically the replacement or the project will need to occur during the duration of the study, which is typically 30 years. An example for this that I like to use is a pool. So maybe it's a brand new pool. We know there's going to be various projects that you're going to need to do to maintain that pool, right? Outside of your annual operating expenses for that pool, you're going to have capital costs and reserve components. So replastering the pool, retiling it, the coping, repairs to the deck, the mechanical equipment, so the pumps, filtration, chlorination, the pool furniture, even the fence, the perimeter fence. There's all kinds of components that are going to need to be included and funded for through that reserve account. But the actual pool structure, the plumbing associated with that, should last beyond the duration of the study, right? That usually has more of, say, a 60-year useful life. And so really, if it's a brand new community, you likely won't see the full replacement of that pool structure in that 30-year study. That's something that as the community continues to age, those long-term items will get worked in. So, maybe when the community, let's say we're doing a community or preparing a study for a community that's 30 years old. Well, now that full pool replacement likely will be in there, included in this study. It is in that horizon now. And so it is time to start funding for that cost, in addition to the routine, plastering and deck repairs and coping. Now you should start incorporating in that full replacement of the pool and the plumbing associated with it. It also has to have a predictable remaining useful life. By that, we mean it really should be something that is fairly predictable, such as, say, a roof replacement or those pool repairs or repaving or a fence replacement, something that regularly does occur and has a typical useful life. The example I like to use here is an insurance deductible. From time to time, we'll be asked to include an insurance deductible kind of contingency. They want to plan on a possible need for that insurance deductible periodically. This is especially kind of ramped up years ago when the earthquake came through. There were associations that did have damage and did have to file a claim and wanted to include a periodic earthquake deductible contingency. We strongly recommended that really isn't the best use of reserve funds. You don't want to plan on these unknowns, things that really aren't certain. It's not a good idea to start collecting funds and planning for those things that really are very difficult to predict. And then lastly, it has to be above a minimum threshold. The reason for that is you really don't want to bog the study down and make it difficult to read and understand with all these really small expenses that ultimately won't affect the funding recommendation. So a good rule of thumb here is about 1% of the budget. So if your association has a $200,000 budget, you probably should set that threshold around $2,000, meaning anything below $2,000 would be considered general maintenance and an operating expense, and anything above $2,000 would be a capital reserve expense and something that should be included in the reserve study. And that's just sort of an estimate or a ballpark. It's not the end all be all. Let's use the example of a pretty large association, maybe has $1 million budget. We're not going to say your cutoff has to be $10,000. They might operate with a $5,000 threshold. So as long as that information is relayed to us or the reserve specialists you work with, they can set the reserve study up accordingly. But that should be a point of discussion so that there is alignment on what that threshold is. And again, I just caution not to go too low You don't want every, $50 or $200 expense included in there, because that really will bog the study down, make it really difficult to read. And when we're talking about, probably $5 million of expenses over the next 30 years, those really small expenses really aren't going to drive those funding recommendations. So it's important to kind of look at the big picture here. So again, a reminder of the reserve study 2 components. There's both that physical evaluation and the financial analysis. The physical evaluation really is that on-site inspection, and the financial analysis is those cash flow projections. And really the goal is to provide adequate funding. So the first portion of the reserve study, that physical evaluation, what is it comprised of? Well, there's both a meeting and an inspection. So during the meeting, we're really focusing on the scope of responsibility, understanding what the association is responsible for maintaining, right? So going over those common elements, making sure we have alignment on what should be included in the reserve study. We're also going to want to discuss a history of any capital projects. So if you've just completed recent projects, maybe you've renovated the clubhouse or performed facade maintenance at a mid-rise. We want to understand what was done as part of those renovations so that we can accurately inspect and forecast out moving forward, make sure that that's accommodated in the reserve study. Same with any planned projects. If you know you're going to renovate the pool or renovate the lobby this year, it's important to relay exactly what will be done. Is that renovation going to include the light fixtures? Are you replacing the coping at the pool? Just so that the reserve specialist has an understanding for those near-term expenses and can accurately forecast out any other planned expenses related to that component. We're also going to want to review the operating budget. We want to make sure that we're not shortfalling or double funding. And by that, I mean, we don't want to assume something's handled through operating when in actuality you want to fund it out of reserves, or we don't want to assume it's funded out of reserves when you're funding it out of operating, right? We don't want to omit any components, but we also don't want you funding for them in two places. So making sure we have alignment there. After that meeting, we're conducting the inspection. The real focus there is on quantifying and condition assessments of those common components, right? In the meeting, we've discussed what the common components are, and now we want to visually assess them and quantify them. So we're looking at that condition and life expectancy. So based on the condition and the age, when do we anticipate the necessary replacement or repair of those capital components? What's the manner of replacement? Maybe it's a really large association that was constructed over various years, and therefore maybe the roofs or the pavement are in various conditions. Maybe it makes sense to phase replacement. Or maybe everything's in really similar condition. Maybe it's a mid-rise building and all of the carpet is worn relatively the same, and you want it to aesthetically look the same. So maybe that is something we're going to coordinate and do at one time. Or maybe it's something that just needs to be replaced ongoing. Maybe the piping, various materials, various uses, various condition. Maybe it makes sense to have partial ongoing replacements of the piping instead of replacing all the piping at one time. So we are looking for the condition, the materials, locations, things that warrant how you should replace the various components. We're also going to look for factors that affect the replacement cost. What's the location like? Is it in downtown DC or is it out in the suburbs where it's a little easier to access? If it is in downtown DC, we probably might need to include, let's say for mechanical equipment on the roof, we might need a crane, right? So there's going to be costs associated with that we need to make sure we take into account. Maybe the retaining wall in a subdivision is back behind homes up against a conservation area where it's pretty difficult to access and to get all the equipment back there. Much easier just to handle a retaining wall right along the street, right? So we're going to have to look for those sort of various situations that ultimately will affect the replacement costs. The reserve specialist is also going to help prioritize projects. So if the roof is failing and the carpet is worn, and the funds are limited, we're going to prioritize replacement of the roof, make sure that the building maintains its kind of structural integrity, and defer the carpet likely, right? Even though you might be tired of looking at it and it's not ideal to have worn carpet, residents can live with that, right? It's not going to adversely affect other components, where really the need is that roof. And so we're going to prioritize that for you above some of the more aesthetic components. Using the example of a pool, we're going to prioritize the plaster over the pool furniture if funds are limited. And so now the financial analysis, this truly is a snapshot in time cash flow analysis. So at the time the study was prepared, what is the beginning fund balance? So that is something that management provides us. How much money does the association have at the time the study is conducted? We're going to look at that current year income and expenses. So we're not going to recommend changing the budget mid-year. So if you provide us the budget, we'll in the current balance, we will kind of project out what the remaining contributions are for this current fiscal year, as well as incorporate any planned expenses or projects that you have. So we'll make sure that we include both of those so that we can come up with a projected year-end balance. We're going to incorporate interest. Unfortunately, it's not as much as we'd like these days, but associations do earn interest on the reserve account, and it's important to make sure that that is reflected in the study. Same with inflation. We include that both on the expenditure side and the financial analysis side. Pricing for components are determined in today's dollars. So what does it cost to replace a roof today? But maybe you're not handling that project for another 8 years. Well, we want to make sure that you have the adequate funds for that more than likely increased cost in 8 years. So we do incorporate an inflation factor. And then same with the funding. We're not going to recommend that you contribute to reserves the same amount today as you do in, say, 20 years from now, right? We will inflate those contributions just to keep up with inflation. And then ultimately, the financial analysis will provide a funding recommendation. What is the ideal level that the association should contribute to the reserve account to offset those planned expenditures that we've just outlined in the reserve expenditures that ultimately result from that physical evaluation. So we've talked about everything that's included in the reserve study. What should be excluded from the reserve study? So since we're focused on those common components, we are going to exclude homeowner components. So even if the association handles the actual replacement of the component, if it's something that's billed back to the homeowner and a homeowner expense, then it should not be included in the reserve study. We truly only want to include common expenses. We also don't want to bog the study down with those minor expenses. These ultimately won't really affect the funding recommendation, and they do overwhelm the inventory. They make it a difficult report to kind of read and digest. So we don't want to bog it down with these really small $50, $100 expenditures. We do want to keep it higher level with those bigger costs and expenses that will really ultimately drive the necessary funding recommendations. And then we also want to exclude any general maintenance. So if there's anything that's regularly scheduled and handled on an annual basis, maybe that's like general maintenance of your landscaping or pool maintenance contract. We really don't want those included in the reserve study. These are for these less frequent, larger costs, not something that's annually or reoccurring. That should just be funded out of general maintenance or operating. So what are some often overlooked components? Stormwater's often forgotten about. Sometimes there are chamber system, vault systems in urban areas, or even these large ponds out in more suburban areas. There are capital expenses associated with those. Lighting, people think these steel poles will last forever, but they will get damaged over time and parts will become obsolete. So it's important to make sure those are included. Perimeter fencing, sometimes that's out of sight, out of mind, but over time those will get damaged and start to deteriorate. So you'll want to make sure you incorporate any fencing. And safe subsurface piping as well. So whether that's irrigation or subsurface utilities, just due to the nature of pipes, they will eventually start to break down. Movement in the soil can cause breakages as well. So that is something that, depending on the age of the community, you will want to make sure you are factoring into the reserve study. So now you know a little bit about reserve studies. How should you facilitate that reserve study? What is your responsibility as part of the reserve study? How can you contribute to it? Well, a reserve specialist is going to want to review a handful of documents prior to that on-site meeting, right? So usually we'll send this list over as soon as we receive a contract. So you have plenty of time to kind of review and compile this information and get it over to us. First and foremost, we absolutely need the financial documents. No matter which provider you work with, they will need a copy of the current balance sheet, so they have that starting balance, as well as the copy of the current budget, so that we can review the budget, make sure that the study is kind of set up aligned, and the budget is incorporated into the reserve study. And then we'll really need to pull out that reserve contribution for this current year. We want to make sure that we do show that remaining contribution as part of that projected year-end balance. We'll want to review the declaration and bylaws. Like I mentioned, they're not always quite crystal clear, but we will want to take a look at them ahead of time, have a rough idea of what the association is responsible for, and then during the meeting we can really kind of discuss the documents and find out some of those areas that maybe you've had to obtain clarity on from legal counsel. We can get confirmation on those, but we do like to have a starting point prior to entering that meeting. Any capital projects that are underway, we'll want to take a look at those. This is really helpful for us to get our arms around what historically has happened, or any of these planned projects that you have coming up. So we'd like to take a look at that so we can all speak about it when we meet. And then lastly, the interest rate. So we can use a projected 30-year interest rate, but if you want us to incorporate their actual rate of return, we're happy to do that as well. Okay, and then just a reminder again, the reserve study does have that two-part evaluation, both the physical evaluation and the financial analysis. The main part we're going to need you to help facilitate with really is that physical evaluation. So this is the on-site meeting that we're going to meet and discuss the reserve study. So ideally, it will occur at the beginning of the day. It typically lasts about an hour. It can be 10 minutes. It sometimes can be 3 hours. It really depends on the size and complexity of the property, as well as any questions that we have or we receive. Ideally, who attends? So typically the manager will attend, and then we really defer to you on who you'd like to invite to the meeting. Typically a couple board members, maybe there's a homeowner with a lot of historical knowledge. Maybe they've been in the property forever and have that knowledge. Maybe they'd be a great addition at that meeting to provide some of that history. There could be a finance committee member or two that wants to be involved. Anyone that's going to actively use the study and has questions about it and is interested in it is welcome to attend. We want to make sure that the meeting remains productive. So we will typically defer to you as the manager on who you want to invite and who you think is most appropriate to attend. We do encourage all attendees to bring any questions or concerns they have. If there's something they want to understand about the process or about the inspection, or maybe there's a concern that they have, there's a retaining wall that they've seen and they're just kind of concerned about it, or a section of the facade, any question, whether it's general or specific in nature, we encourage that and welcome it. It's best to kind of speak about all these things at that kickoff meeting prior to the inspection to make sure that those are all looked at, taken into account, and ultimately included in the reserve study. And then most inspections will conclude the same day. This really will depend on the size. Sometimes there's really large properties or complex buildings where we need to come back a second or possibly third day, but for the most part, it will conclude that same day. So how do you facilitate the inspection? It is helpful to notify residents prior. The reserve specialist is often walking around with a clipboard and a camera and maybe a measuring wheel. So it does kind of sometimes create concern with residents wondering why we're taking photographs of various things. Of course, reserve specialists are always properly identified, usually with a company logo and business cards, but it can alleviate some concerns if the homeowners are notified ahead of time and understand that someone will be walking around the property performing that condition assessment. We welcome board involvement on the initial portion of the inspection. If there's any certain areas they want to show us, or maybe a section of the walking path, or make sure that we see a certain bridge, we are happy to do that with the board. For sake of their time and to make it as productive as possible, we typically like to do that right after the meeting. So we'd have the meeting, then we'd immediately go to those areas of concern that they have. If it is a building with locked spaces, maybe a mid-rise building, we are going to need someone to provide us access to any of those locked spaces. So mechanical rooms, probably roof access. We'd like to do that right away as well so that we can free up everyone else's time. And that timeline will really vary. Like I said, could be as quick as 10 minutes for the meeting, and maybe there's nothing that they want to be a part of on the inspection, or maybe it's 3 hours where they have a lot of questions and certain things they want to show us and rooms that we need to see. So that really will vary, but we'd like to do all of that right away. And then make sure that we leave some time to kind of free up your time as management, and also free up the board's time, and allow the engineer some time to have that independent inspection. The reason we want some time for an independent inspection is really to ensure that the engineer can solely focus on what they're doing, which is that condition assessment and quantification, right? If they're trying to maintain a conversation with the treasurer, and they're looking at this and talking about that, it's hard to do that full evaluation that they need to do. So we do make sure that the engineer will have time for that independent inspection where they really can focus on the quantification and condition assessment. So after that, after you've facilitated the meeting and the inspection, the engineer goes back. Your part is really done. The engineer goes back to the office, crunches the numbers, puts together this full report, and then you'll get it over email typically, and a hard copy as well if you'd like. So now that you receive it, how should you interpret it? A reserve study will look different depending on the different provider that you may work with. Right, the layout and format will vary, but ultimately the information included in the reserve study should be relatively the same. It'll just look different. So where do you start once you receive the reserve study? Really, the executive summary. All reports should have an executive summary right up front. It's this kind of concise, maybe a page or two, high-level overview of the findings. It's a nice short document, or portion of the document that's easily distributed to all the homeowners, maybe potential buyers, where they can see sort of the quick high-level findings. When did the study occur? What was the funding goal? What ultimately drove those funding recommendations? What funding method was utilized? What are the near-term projects that we should prioritize? What are our real near-term needs that we need to focus on? And then, of course, the recommended funding. Ideally, how much should we be contributing to reserves? What is the ultimate recommendation of the reserve study? The next section of the reserve study is that expenditure spreadsheet. So again, this is going to look different depending on the provider, but all of this information should be included, just probably in a different format. So you'll have the component inventory, you'll have the quantification, you'll have the useful life, the timing, the recommended timing, the unit cost, the total project cost, and then of course the inflated cost by year. So I like to say that this is kind of like a matrix. You can look at the detailed information by line item, or you can look at the big picture. What projects do we need to do in any given year? So as you enter the next fiscal year, as we're entering 2022, you can look at that column and say, okay, what projects are slated for 2022? What do we want to tackle versus what do we maybe want to defer? So that expenditure plan is really developed from that physical evaluation. Based on that physical evaluation and expenditure plan, we prepare a reserve funding plan. And so this is really to offset those planned expenditures, right? Again, a lot of detailed information here where you can look at it, the true cash flow by year, or you can look at the big picture. Ideally, what do we need to contribute on an annual basis? It truly is a cash flow exercise where you're providing that starting balance. We're going to include the remaining current year contributions. We're going to include interest. We're going to subtract out any planned expenditures to come up with a projected year-end balance that just becomes the following year's starting balance. So as we enter the next fiscal year, we have that starting balance. We're going to tell you the recommended reserve contributions. That's what we're calculating. We're going to incorporate interest. We're going to incorporate those planned expenditures that we've outlined. And then we're going to come up with projected year-end balance, which again becomes the following year starting balance. So it truly is just a cash flow analysis. This is a great tool to look at as you're planning and budgeting, but I think it's helpful to see this table in more of a graphical form. So we do include a graph that's really great to provide to homeowners, maybe say in an annual meeting, to help understand the importance of reserves. So the blue line is that reserve balance. The green bars are the reserve contributions, and the red bars are the planned expenditures. So if reserves didn't exist, essentially you would have to have a real varied budget, right? There's years where there's relatively low capital expenditures and years with really high expenditures. So you'd have these spikes, these peaks and valleys in your budget, and it would really vary and make it really difficult for homeowners to kind of personally financially plan. So the goal is to contribute to this reserve account on these relatively stable. You can see those green bars are relatively flat with just inflationary increases over time. And the result is really how the blue line and what that reserve balance will do over time, right? So there's going to be years where you're in growth, which is, the first few years of the study where the expenses are relatively small and you're contributing more than you're expending. So you're growing that reserve account. But then just a few years out, you have these years of really large expenses where you're spending much more than you're contributing, right? And you're really draining that reserve account, which is great. That's the goal. We don't want to keep the reserve account really high because then you're over collecting funds, right? You want to save for it. And then when the time comes, have enough to where you're adequately funded, but not overfunded. So we want to bring that balance pretty low. We don't like to bring it quite down to zero. We do want to put in sort of a factor of safety or a cushion. We know needs sort of will vary. Something might get accelerated. Maybe the cost was slightly more than was anticipated due to changes in the market. So we want to make sure that there is a little bit of wiggle room there. So we won't bring it quite down to zero. Then it kind of hovers down there as you have years of large expenditures. And then it's pretty low expenses for the next, say, maybe 15 or so years, 10 or 15 years, where you're contributing more than you're spending, right? So that balance continues to grow. And then ideally, again, you have those years of really, really large expenditures to where if you didn't have that reserve fund, you'd essentially have to special assess or take out a bank loan. So you're now draining that reserve account. You're spending those funds that you've been putting away over the last decade, and ultimately avoiding that special assessment because you have the fund to pull these expenses from and to really fund those projects. So I think this is a really great tool to help the average homeowner understand the point of reserves. Otherwise, they see this account with $600,000 sitting there and they say, well, why are we continuing to contribute to that account? Can't you lower our fees? Can't we be spending that money? Well, this helps understand the needs of the association and why you can't just fund a landscaping project out of reserves. So again, just wanted to kind of show it in the other form as well. This truly is just the cash flow analysis that the graph represents. So the last section of the report, again, all reports will have a narrative section. It is going to look different, but all providers will provide some sort of narrative. This really is the explanation of the expenditure plan. So here's where all the detailed information occurs. What is the quantity? What does that include? What's the history of the element? What condition was observed? There's going to be photographic records. So what was observed, snapshot in time, what condition did we see, what concerns do we see that we need to make you aware of, or what things looked great, and maybe that's why we're extending the useful life or replacement timing. It truly captures the condition that the reserve specialist or engineer saw. And then we're going to include component details as well. So what does repaving mean? Is that an overlay? Is it a mill and overlay? Is it a total replace? When you see the blacktop, what's really going on beneath the surface there? This is really to help educate homeowners on those components, what's included in that project, what it entails, really just sort of the information kind of behind that expenditure plan. And then, of course, if you're not able to tell from the report, if that narrative section isn't quite complete, if you have any questions, just ask. Your reserve specialist really is going to be your best resource for that. So whether it's 2 days after you receive the report or 2 years from now when you're tackling one of those projects, if you have any kind of concerns or questions about the scope of work, the reserve specialist really will be a great resource to kind of talk through that, help you understand what the recommendations are and what was considered at the time the reserve study was conducted. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you so much for your time. If you are attending this session live, my email is there. If you can email me, if you need the CMCA continuing education credit, I will make sure to get you signed up and get you that credit. Again, my email is just mbaldry@reserveadvisors.com. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them now, or reach out at any time if any future questions do come up. But if there's anything I can answer for you, I am here and happy to help.